Hi, I'm Gary Ralph, and this is another of the series of lectures that I'm videotaping for History 101, um, Europe and the World Part 1. And today we are going to be talking a little bit about the Renaissance. Whenever I get to this part of the course, I always feel like, oh my gosh, are we really going to do this in just 2 days or so? Because you could very easily spend a whole year, 2 semesters on the Renaissance and not really have to dig deep for stuff to talk about. The Renaissance was partly a matter of literary accomplishment. There was a lot of scientific advance being made. Certainly new ideas about political science and things like that. And art, painting and sculpture. Really, in just about every aspect of Western European culture, there were enormous advances being made by a lot of people. So, in fact, when I ask a question on an exam about the Renaissance, I always have to say to students, don't just list a whole bunch of names. Choose a few names and try to say something meaningful about the people that you do mention. And that's actually what I'm going to do today. The next set of videotape lectures that I have are about the Reformation, which was, in fact, an aspect of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was also a period of religious change. And I do talk about the Renaissance a little bit at the beginning of those lectures, because at the time I recorded those lectures, as I say, I didn't realize I was going to be doing the whole rest of European history. But there are things I focus on in the lectures on the Reformation that are religious, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the creative and intellectual accomplishments of the Renaissance. I'm on granola stuck in my lip. Then after the lectures on the Reformation, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the scientific accomplishments. So hopefully I'll be looking at it from 3 different aspects, and hopefully I'll be able to cover sufficient ground that I won't feel like I've done an injustice to the extreme complexity of the Renaissance. Anyway, to begin with, like a lot of these historical phenomena that we give a name to afterwards, this is not something where a gong went off and said, okay, the Renaissance has started. Everybody, at your marks. And it didn't really end in a specific time either. This is a vague description because, for one thing, the Renaissance started in Italy. Most people really agree that was where the things started happening that we identify with the Renaissance. And when the Renaissance was really kind of wrapping up in continental Europe, England was still having it. Shakespeare is definitely a Renaissance figure, and Shakespeare died in the early 1600s. So it's a period that changes depending on which part of Europe you talk about. But generally speaking, looking from hindsight, there are a lot of things that happened that at the time they happened, we would have just said, oh yeah, that guy's really bright. But in retrospect, we think, okay, this is part of the Renaissance. And Renaissance means rebirth. It's a French word. Naissance, as I point out, I think also in the lecture on the Reformation, is a French word for birth. So Renaissance means the rebirth. Now, what is this the rebirth of? It's the rebirth of what, in retrospect, we think of as European culture. I showed you this graph when I was talking about the terrible 1300s that started out with the high level of accomplishment of the Roman Empire. And then there was this period that we call the Dark Ages. And then it starts going up again with economic revival. There's a slight glitch during the 1300s. And then we get up to the period of the Renaissance. And, friends of mine who specialize in the period that is sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages will say, it wasn't like everybody was sitting around twiddling their thumbs. There was a lot of important stuff that happened during the period between the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance, and that is true. But one of the things that is a distinguishing feature of the Renaissance is that people began to go back and pay a lot more attention to the culture of ancient Greece and Rome. Actually, the culture that we spent the first third of this course, when we still had the opportunity to meet in a classroom, the first third of this course talking about. And there had been, as I say, in my lecture on the intellectual revival, there had been a kind of rediscovery of Aristotle, thanks to the Muslims and their translation of Aristotle into Arabic. But the attention that was being paid to Greek and Roman literature was considerable in the Renaissance. In fact, not only were they discovering Aristotle, but they were going around into all of the monastic libraries and pulling out even Latin works that nobody had been paying attention to for a long time, even though they could read Latin in the West. So one of the kind of marks that you can recognize a Renaissance writer by is that he or she, there are she's in this movement, is paying a lot of attention and focusing on the revival of interest in and the revival of knowledge about the ancient Greek and Roman writers, which kind of makes this semester a nice parallel, because you start out with the Greek and Romans, and then when the Renaissance shows up, we're close to the end of the first semester. In fact, I pointed out that the Renaissance ends in the 1600s, and the cutoff date for Europe and the World Part 1 is 1648. So, and partly because of this, and partly because he was an important figure in his own time, and sort of you look at him and you realize that something new is starting, the generally acknowledged kind of kickoff of the Renaissance starts with the work of Dante Alighieri, usually just referred to as Dante by his first name. He lived in the city of Florence from 1265 to 1321. And he wrote several important works, but the most important work he wrote is a long poem called La Divina Commedia, which literally translates into the Divine Comedy. And when we think of a comedy today, we think, oh, how funny. That's not really what Dante was meaning for you to think. Commedia, in the days that he was writing the poem, was any drama, anything either produced on a stage or written in the form of something that could be produced on the stage. And in fact, the La Divina Commedia is not a play in the sense that we would think today. It doesn't have lines that different people speak or anything like that. But it is a dramatic story. It is a story that plays out as a kind of adventure. And the main person who is the sort of star of the adventure is Dante himself. The work is written in the first person. And this one person, in the course of this long poem, visits hell, purgatory, and paradise, or heaven. And there are, in fact, the poem is divided into 3 sections by those titles. The first section is called Inferno, which is Italian for hell. The second is Purgatorio, and the third is Paradiso. And in his tour of all of these places, his guide, who kind of takes him along and shows him where to go next, is Virgil, the Latin poet who wrote the Aeneid during the lifetime of the Roman emperors. So this is a sign. You should make a light bulb go off in your head and say, okay, this is a Renaissance thing. But it's actually, the Divina Commedia is both medieval and Renaissance in a kind of interesting way. And in fact, I have here on the next chart that it's kind of a summation of medieval thought, because the poem is not just it's like Virgil takes Dante to hell. This is hell. Okay, now let's move on. That's not the way he does it. When he's in hell and purgatory and paradise, he introduces Dante to a lot of people. A lot of people who are in hell, a lot of people who are in purgatory, a lot of people who are in paradise. By the way, some of these people were not dead yet that he's talking about, and some of them who Dante described as being in hell were very annoyed to find themselves there in the poem. But because Dante goes through this whole group of people in each third of the poem and tells the story of them, why they are in hell, that kind of thing, he's really sort of talking about the whole of European history up to this point, because he tells about everybody he knows. Talks about all of the people he knows that he thinks should be in hell, or he expects are going to be in hell when they die. But he also talks about all of the people who are in heaven. So, and anyway, it's a kind of big encyclopedia of medieval knowledge of the world. And it's also, as I say, a typical Renaissance poem. Not only because Virgil is mentioned. One of the things that was unusual for the time about a poem like this is that Dante did not write it in Latin. As I point out, and I think I pointed out earlier, Latin was at least the second language of practically everybody in Western Europe who could be considered an intellectual. People who wanted to be priests learned to read and write and speak Latin. And it was sort of an international language as far as Western Europe was concerned. So if you were trying to write something important and significant that you wanted everybody to be able to read who was interested in that kind of thing, you would write it in Latin so that everybody would be able to read it. I mean, even people who were living in places like Bulgaria, where Latin is not really spoken on the street, would be able to read it because if they were scholars, they had learned how to read and write Latin. However, Dante does not write La Divina Commedia in Latin. He writes in Tuscan, which is a dialect of Italian that was spoken in Florence, the city where he lived. I note that this is the vernacular. If you went out into the streets of Florence into the 1300s, you'd hear people speaking Tuscan, which was a different form of Italian that was spoken in the rest of Italy. One of the things that happens is because Dante's poem becomes so popular and so recognized is that Tuscan becomes the form of Italian that most people start to write literary masterpieces in. And in fact, it's sort of the version of Italian that has come to be the Italian that is spoken today by most Italian people. You have to wonder why he did this. Why didn't he go on writing stuff in Latin the way all the other educated people were? One reason was that he wanted to open up the field of knowledge to people who were not priests, who were not trained in universities. If you had some wealthy man who wanted to experience the art of the times, the wealthy man might not have learned how to read and write, but he might have somebody who would be able to read to him La Divina Commedia, and the person who would be reading La Divina Commedia to him would be reading it to him in a language that he could understand. If you'd been reading it to him in Latin, the guy would not have been able to understand it because he hadn't learned Latin any more than he had learned to read and write. But the fact that La Divina Commedia is written in a language that people on the street can understand is one sign that we're moving into a period where the acquisition of knowledge and the intellectual activity is not restricted to a small group of people. It is really sort of open to anybody who wants to get into that. And that's one of the typical signs of the Renaissance. Another important figure, this is sort of the next generation of Renaissance writers, is Petrarch, who was a scholar to begin with. One of the things that happens in the Renaissance is once the writings of Aristotle began to permeate European culture again as a result of the Muslim translations into Arabic, and people become much more interested in ancient Greek and Latin culture in general. So they go around collecting the manuscripts that still exist, at least, in the libraries of Western Europe. They're almost all Latin because, as I said, the Greeks, people forgot how to read Greek and then they threw it away. But the manuscripts, no printing press as yet. I don't use the expression as of yet, by the way, that's incorrect, even though everybody uses it now. But you had all of these manuscripts that survived because they had been copied and recopied and recopied from the old manuscripts. So you had an original manuscript, and then you had a copy, and then you had another copy and another copy, and or multiple copies. And then you had these multiple copies of the one manuscript that were spread out all over Europe, and other people made copies of those. And not only do errors creep in, because scribes are not perfect, but different errors creep into different manuscripts. So one of the big jobs of the Renaissance was getting together all the available manuscripts of one particular work, comparing them, seeing where they differ, and saying, well, this is the one where the mistake was made, and this must have been the original one because it makes more sense. This is one of the things that Petrarch was doing. He was collecting the surviving copies of copies of copies of copies, and then comparing them together to try and decide which version was the original version and which was the version that was the result of scribal error. Let me stop and come back